One of my favorite storylines from the 2022 college football season was the rise of Kansas football. This was a team that was consistently at the bottom of the conference and never really did anything. They didn't produce many star players, yet alone have guys who could potentially be a first-round pick or be Heisman Trophy contenders. One of the main reasons why Kansas won so many games last year was because of their quarterback Jalon Daniels. At one point though, he was a 2-star recruit, was told by Chip Kelly that he wasn't good enough to play quarterback, and arrived at Kansas with little to no hope of ever making the NFL. Now as we flash forward, he's put the program on his back, become one of the top quarterbacks in all of college football, and could be a first rounder, and right now has a chance at winning the Heisman Trophy this year. In today's video, we're going to talk about the rise of Jalon Daniels, go through his insane story, talk about how he built up the Kansas program, and why he has so much hype. But before we get started, quickly be sure to leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new and love college football content, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I could cover next. Now, let's get started and talk about the insane rise of Jalon Daniels. So going back in time, things were really difficult for Jalon as his father was not in the house and his mother did everything in the world to try and make things normal. She worked full-time for an insurance company and even took on a second job at Toys R Us. And that meant she had to drive him back and forth between football practices, and she wanted to make sure he was one of those kids that wasn't just running around the neighborhood all the time. In 2007, he was 5 years old, and at the time, he was playing left tackle. He was the guy who was supposed to protect the quarterback, not the one who was supposed to lead the offense. So, he actually came up with a plan. He'd throw the football as hard as he could at the coach every time the play stopped, and he was determined to be the team's quarterback. Daniels would spend the next 2 weeks throwing the ball to his coach, and eventually the plan worked. He was named the starting quarterback by his team's third game. The following year, he started to play tackle football for the first time and fell in love with the game even more. Daniels always knew he wanted to be different, as he was the only football player in a basketball family. He ended up quitting playing basketball in grade school and gave up baseball when he was in high school. He believed that he was talented and that would be enough for him to be recruited. He said, quote, "For me and my mom, we didn't really know much about the recruiting process and trying to get to a Division I school. We just knew the traditional story that if you balled at whatever high school you're at, you get some attention. Once we got to high school, we realized that wasn't the case." She noticed a shift in the game's importance in Jalon's life, and in turn, it became more important to her. When it came time to choose a high school, they wanted to go where he'd have a shot to play quarterback. A handful of his youth league guys were going to Narbonne High School, so they ended up choosing that one. In high school, he faced an uphill battle on the depth chart, as he was behind Jalen Henderson, a guy who's now at Texas A&M, Kyle Williams, who was a receiver at Washington State, and they also brought in Jake Garcia, who was a former 4-star recruit who now plays at Mizzou. Those 3 guys would be ahead of him, and he said, quote, "There were 35 to 40 guys who went Division I and maybe 30 who went to Power 5 schools. I was a small fish in a very big pond." He knew it was time to leave when he was put on the freshman team as a sophomore. He got no respect or praise, but his teammates said, quote, "People wrote him off, but he always kept God in his life. It didn't faze him one bit, and I actually think it made him better and put a chip on his shoulder." Before his junior year, he met with the coaches at Lawndale High School, and they asked him who he modeled his game after. He said Aaron Rodgers. The coach sort of laughed and said, "Don't get me wrong, you have a cannon of an arm, but you're closer to Michael Vick, buddy, just not as fast." I mean, could you necessarily blame the coach for thinking that? Well, in his first season, he'd start to play like it. He ended up leading his school to a 14-2 record and threw for 2,351 yards with 26 touchdowns and nearly 1,000 yards and 10 touchdowns on the ground. His teammate was future Utah running back Jordan Wilmore, but no one cared to recruit Daniels. Despite that, he had no college interest, and his dream was not looking like a reality until he met quarterback guru Sam Fisher. Fisher had been training quarterbacks in the LA area for 6 years, but hadn't heard of the young Daniels until he contacted him a week before the workout. In an area littered with great quarterbacks, Daniels was a complete unknown. And at the time, he was barely ranked in the top 3,000 in the class of 2020, and he knew he'd have to be extraordinary to stand out. Daniels would show up to that workout, flick his wrist, and throw the ball 60 to 70 yards down the field. Fisher said, quote, "Immediately, I was watching the ball come out of his hand, and I'm like, I had to watch it a second and a third time. I was like, the kid is legit." He starts throwing the ball around, and by the end of the session, I knew he was special. He was truly a diamond in the rough, and Fisher was determined to get him to a big-time college football program. He talked up Daniels to anybody who would listen, and thanks to Fisher, he'd work out for multiple schools, including Georgia and UCLA. Neither, though, would give him an offer, but UT Martin did. That was the first school that ever offered him, and Chip Kelly told him that he wasn't a quarterback, but just a good athlete. Kelly's also came out and said he regretted letting Jalon get away. Jalon Daniels would occasionally talk with Brett Dearmon. He was an up-and-coming member of the KU football staff, And as an analytics whiz, he loved what he saw from Jalen. He said, quote, "I would plug his statistics in, and all the stuff that came up ranked him with the top quarterbacks in the country. There was just one problem though. Dearman didn't have any power to get him an offer. Because of that, Kansas would not offer him for a while, so Daniels made peace with committing to Middle Tennessee. They were a solid, decent FBS school, had a good system, and now he's a 3-star. But he wanted more. Weeks before he would verbally commit to the Blue Raiders, Dearman was promoted to the offensive coordinator for the Jayhawks in the middle of the season, and in their debut, Kansas scored 48 points in a loss to Texas. Dearman had to act fast with early signing day approaching, so he convinced Les Miles to travel to Lawndale to watch Daniels play. Shortly after that, KU offered Daniels a spot on the team. Jalen said, quote, "I got home Sunday, prayed about it, and just kept thinking about it. Monday I came in and said, yeah, I want to go to Kansas, and that's where I'm going to go." It was a tough decision, and he said the call to Middle Tennessee was heartbreaking, but he remembered a saying he learned from his godfather: if you want to be the best, you have to play the best. Jalen was definitely underrated, as by pretty much every site, he was listed as a 2-star recruit. 24/7 Sports, though, was a little bit higher. They ranked him as a 3-star player, the number 49 dual threat quarterback, and the 2,305th best player in the class of 2019. How would the underdog do at Kansas? Well, let's take a look. When Daniels would arrive at Kansas, no one knew who he was, and he was not used to losing. He only lost 3 total games in high school, and going to KU was a complete reality check for him. Kansas had only won a total of 7 games in 3 years. At first, he was the 3rd-string quarterback, and he'd get into his first game in garbage time. This would happen because one of the quarterbacks ahead of him on the depth chart, Thomas McVitie, would end up going down with an injury. Jalen went on to start 6 games his freshman year, and KU went 0-9. It was pretty clear that the team's culture needed an overhaul, and there was talent on the roster, but all of that was from Les Miles. During that season, he got sacked 9 times against Oklahoma, and KU struggled against FCS schools. It was time for a change. He said, quote, "We're a Power 5 football team. We shouldn't be having close games at FCS schools. We shouldn't be having these close games that are not Power 5. We needed to be able to elevate our standards." Lance Leipold would be hired as the new head coach, and this would completely change everything. He was now put into a quarterback battle at North Texas transfer Jason Bean and returning player Miles Kendrick. It didn't go according to plan at first, as the KU staff wanted to redshirt him. He ended up trusting their judgment, but to start out the 2021 season, the team went 1-7, winning only their game against an FCS school. He absolutely hated the redshirt and actually lost some hope in KU, but he got his chance. In Kansas's loss to Kansas State, both Bean and Kendrick would suffer injuries, and Daniels would have to finish out the game. The following week against Texas, Daniels threw for 247 yards and 4 touchdowns. He had no interceptions, and they had their famous play where they went for 2 and won 57-56 on the road against the Longhorns. This was arguably the most famous KU football play in over a decade, and Daniels was the real deal. Except if he played anymore, he'd have to burn his red shirt, and Leipold at least gave him that choice. He said it wasn't a hard decision at all. After all, he just wanted an opportunity. He ended up playing it out and would finish the 2021 season with 860 yards, 7 touchdowns, and 3 picks. He also had 3 more rushing scores on the ground. Going into 2022, Daniels was the clear starter, and he'd end up having a special season. In their first game against Tennessee Tech, Daniels would combine for 3 total touchdowns. The following week against West Virginia, he burst onto the national scene as he combined for 300 yards and had 3 scores. More importantly, Kansas went on the road and beat West Virginia in overtime, and they are now 2-0. In week 3, they'd absolutely demolished Houston, and Daniels had an unbelievable game. He threw for 3 touchdowns and also had over 100 yards and 2 scores on the ground. The Kansas offense was dynamic, and they were absolutely on fire. In week 4, they play against Duke, and somehow the Blue Devils were also unbeaten, and this game was all of a sudden a big deal. Daniels had a nearly perfect game as he went 19 of 23 for 324 yards and 4 touchdowns, with nearly 100 yards and a touchdown on the ground. He'd have a touchdown the following week against Iowa State. The Jayhawks were ranked, and now number 17 TCU is coming to town. Unfortunately, this would be a very tough blow to them, as in this game, Daniels would go down with an injury. While the backup Jason Bean did really well in his absence, Kansas ended up not being able to convert and lost 38-31. Daniels would now miss substantial time and would finally return for the Texas game. Unfortunately, it just wasn't the same, as while he did throw for 2 touchdowns, they lost 55-14, and then they also lost to Kansas State in the final game of the regular season. Luckily, Kansas had already won 6 games though, so they were selected to play in the Liberty Bowl. Against Arkansas, he'd go off. He threw for 544 yards with 5 touchdowns and another score on the ground. While he did have 2 interceptions, this was an insane game. In their first bowl game in 14 years, he became the first player in FBS history to record over 500 plus passing yards, 5 plus touchdowns, and a rushing touchdown in one game. In total, he finished the year with 2,014 yards with 18 touchdowns and 7 scores on the ground. He also completed 67% of his passes and probably could have gone on to the NFL, but he decided to come back. There were some worried that he would actually transfer back home closer to California, but he officially partnered with Adidas, and it turns out there was no announcement about transferring, so he is now back. Just a couple weeks ago, ESPN dropped a list of top returning quarterbacks, and according to QBR, Daniels is the #1 guy in the country. It said, quote, "Are you surprised at who landed at #1 from an efficiency standpoint? In terms of playing within a system and maximizing his skill set, few quarterbacks were better than Jalon Daniels last season." Now, he also got more awards as he's the preseason Offensive Player of the Year in the Big 12 and finds himself as the face of the Kansas program. This is a huge deal, as right now he's projected as a day 2 quarterback and someone who could slide into the first round if he has another insane season. He's extremely accurate, has that it factor, has already put up good stats, and has elevated a losing program to the spotlight. That in itself is a huge deal, but will Kansas come out flat, or will they be able to build upon last year? That's one of the big questions, and Daniels is going to be the main guy everyone's focused on, and I hope it all goes well for him. But what do you guys think? If you're a Kansas fan, what do you think of Jalon Daniels? How will the Jayhawks do in 2023? And what player should I cover next? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all of the videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.